30s, and there was not a single samurai among them.
150 articles were devoted to civil rights, and the power of sovereignty was vested in the people, not the monarch.
When most people think about the history of that time, all they think about is how Japan's leaders tried to modernize from above, down onto the people, trying to limit freedom and equality. But in response to that, the documents I found in that warehouse showed that the Japanese people were trying to modernize from the bottom up, trying to work towards greater democracy and greater freedom.
Since Irokawa's discovery, more village constitutions have been unearthed all over Japan. Proof that by the late 1870s, democratic ideas were sweeping the countryside. Pressure was building on the Meiji leaders to open up the government.
It's in this context that, without doubt, the most important of these government leaders, Ito Hirobumi, entrusts himself, he wrote his own orders and put the emperor's seals on them, to write a constitution. That he buys off the opposition by promising them that within a decade there will be an assembly of elected representatives of the people. Ito's problem then is to give them what he's promised, but to give away as little as he possibly can. Above all, not to give them genuine democracy. By this time, Ito has discovered his idol, Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, the man who has unified Germany in 1870 and has put together a peculiar form of government. It's a government in which neither the parliament nor the king actually exercises real authority over the imperial bureaucracy. The bureaucracy basically does what it wants to do, and it does so in the name of national welfare, of strengthening the state.
Ito took the Prussian constitution and adapted it to the Japanese political stage. In Bunraku, Japan's classical puppet theater, the puppet handlers are in full view. But dressed in black, they seem to fade away behind the colorful puppets. In the same way, Ito and the oligarchs seem to disappear behind the gaudy symbols of a new parliament and constitution. Politicians came and went, but Ito and the oligarchs stayed in place, discreet, but at center stage, guiding the action.
Perhaps the key element in this is the position of the emperor. The emperor is made absolutely sovereign. The Constitution is bestowed by the emperor to the people. The importance of this is not that it actually gave power to the emperor. It meant that the emperor's advisors are basically beyond the law.
But despite the efforts of Ito and the oligarchs, elements of true democracy slowly began to seep into Japan's parliamentary system.
The Meiji Constitution gradually became the property of the Japanese people. It happened gradually, but even in the Meiji period, by the end of the period, a geisha whose client had not paid was capable of saying to him, he's unconstitutional. It simply wasn't done to contravene what were then known as the rights and duties of the Japanese subject.
The Meiji bureaucrats had secured their power. Now they moved to fortify Japan against the growing might of the Western powers. They saw that the West was strong because industry and science produced weapons that Asia did not have. They came up with a new slogan, Fukoku Kyohei, rich nation, strong military. To make the nation rich and the military strong, Japan had to find a way to pay for it. That meant finding something that other countries wanted to buy. In Japan, that was silk. silk exports paid for Japan's modernization, and it introduced the Japanese people to a new economic reality.
Well, it's extraordinary how these Japanese farmers, still living in the same feudal villages their ancestors had lived in, making the same crops, suddenly found themselves part of international economics. There's a blight in the silk industry in Italy. There's a boom in Japan. They're making a lot of money. There's a depression in the United States. Nobody wants to buy silk stockings anymore. The money they got from this basic crop was the fuel for Japan's transplantation into a new economy, a new civilization.
Here we see the government absorbing the surplus from the agricultural sector and transforming it and shifting it to the initial industrial sector.
The government wanted to modernize fast, so they tried to do it all themselves. The state built factories, bought warships. Then the government ran out of money.
The Japanese, at this point, I think, here invent one of the great institutions of all times. They decide to subcontract the state's goals to the private sector. And this is what leads ultimately to the zaibatsu.
Zaibatsu were Japan's industrial combines. In Nagasaki Harbor, Mitsubishi was one of the first private companies to form the kind of close relationship with government that continues to spur Japan's economy today. In the 1880s, Mitsubishi was just a small shipping company in a very primitive industry. The government wanted Japan to build its own modern ships, but the government didn't want to pay for them. The government's solution was to subsidize companies like Mitsubishi until they could pay for the new ships.
Bureaucracy tried to co-opt the business sector, and that is to bring them into the establishment and tame them, and then use them for the national interest.
It's sort of an early version of what we in America call the military-industrial complex. Their achievements were national achievements, but any profit they made was private property. And that's exactly the case with Lockheed, General Dynamics, North American Rockwell. Their achievements are national achievements, but any profit they make is private property. And that's exactly what the Japanese pioneered in the 1880s.
The speed of the Meiji transformation was breathtaking. In Europe, the Industrial Revolution took 150 years. Japan went from rice paddies to factories in less than 40. Family silk farms led to textile factories and then to steel mills. 15 years after Perry gave the shogun a toy train, the Japanese had built a real railway from Tokyo to Yokohama. Progress was fast, but the cost was high. In textile mills, girls as young as 11 years old worked 12 to 19 hours a day in stifling sweatshops. Conditions were even more severe in heavy industry and the coal mines. The worst of these was Gunkajima, Battleship Island. It lies 4 miles outside of Nagasaki Harbor, a ghostly relic of the cost of Japan's modernization. During Meiji, Battleship Island was a Mitsubishi coal mine, surrounded by a high wall meant to keep the sea out and the people in. The small island is choked with scores of dormitories, formerly filled by prisoners, outcasts, and poor farmers. Their quarters were called takobeya, octopus dens, small, dark cells that came to house entire families. Many children were raised on Battleship Island. In the 1920s, a school was built, along with a company store. But in the Meiji era, children joined their mothers and fathers in the burning hot shafts of the island's towering mountain of coal.
It was hell. This kind of mine work was true hell. It was a very big problem. Many people tried to escape, but they couldn't, because it was an island. Records show that when people were caught trying to leave, they met a horrible end. Around 1890, there were newspaper accounts of miners who were murdered by their bosses when they were caught trying to escape from Battleship Island.
Inside the coal pits, temperatures rose to 130 degrees. Men and women worked nearly naked, crawling in shafts too low to allow them to stand. When a cholera epidemic broke out, Mitsubishi burned all the victims, dead or alive.
This is what happens when a society does this. Moves from agriculture to industry. It is a very costly and miserable transition. And Japan did as bad and as well as the rest of these countries, both then and the countries that are doing it now.
While in Japan the cost of modernizing was high, in China the cost of not modernizing was even higher. In the port cities, the weight of Western privilege was heavy. Sikh guards of the British Army watched over Chinese prisoners. Poverty and hunger were everywhere. Modernizing China was no easy task. China had the manpower to transform the country, but China's technology was as outdated as its ruler. For decades, the Empress Dowager and her corrupt advisors had ruthlessly manipulated the Chinese government. The Empress opposed reform because it threatened her hold on power. Instead of looking to the future, she invoked a nostalgia for China's glorious past.
China intellectually was still gripped by the most unbelievably tenacious conservatism, that they could not truly acknowledge the threat they faced without simultaneously turning the entire structure of the society in a revolutionary direction.
Poverty was transforming China. But the Empress and her Manchu court ignored the hunger in the streets of Shanghai and Canton, evidence of the building discontent that would eventually erupt in revolution. They saw no reason for change, so they resisted it. It was to Japan that young Chinese reformers turned for a model of successful modernization.
Any young East Asian who hoped to develop his country, the place he went was to Tokyo to study or to Kyoto. This produces one of the great ironies, whether Japan was to lead an Asian Renaissance against Western colonialism, or whether Japan should in fact join the colonialists, join the club.
Japan soon made its choice. In Korea, the Hermit Kingdom. Under China's protection, Korea had tried to hide itself away from outside powers and the modern world. But by the 1890s, industrializing Japan wanted rice from Korea and access to Korea's markets. Just as Perry had opened up Japan, Japan confronted China over the right to open up Korea. In 1894, Japan invaded Korea and provoked a war with China.